Welcome to another day in Biden's America and to the 10th episode of the Constitution and American Life with the Friends of Publius. As we go to tape this segment, the Phillies and Rangers are looking to have an edge in the MLB playoffs. Israel and the Palestinians are involved in, I believe, their 8th war since the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. And the House of Representatives has now gone 16 days without a Speaker of the House of Representatives. And yes, human beings are the superior species on Earth, I think we're learning. And yes, we are still the shining city on the hill for other countries around the world to praise and follow. So that's my conclusion to what's going on in the world today. In this segment that we're going to talk about today, we are asked to discuss what role history and tradition should play in our understanding of the Constitution and its amendments. Specifically, we are asked to respond to the opinion written by Clarence Thomas in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruen 2022 that argued that the government must then justify its regulation by demonstrating that it is consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. What is both fun and funny about this is that if we look at the opinion of the majority in the Bruen case, they are going to use a 17th century judicial decision in England that overturns a 14th century statute in English common law to interpret an 18th century American amendment and how that applies to a 21st century American society. What a journey through history the court has taken. Before we begin, let us provide a little context and background here to the gun issue in the United States of America. From the very beginning of our republic until 2008, there was a consensus, understanding that the Second Amendment established a collective right pertaining to state militias and not an individual right. This was articulated in one of the few cases to deal with the Second Amendment, Miller versus the United States, 1939, which was decided 8-0. So the Heller case in 2008 overturned long-standing precedents and, in the view of this commentator, violated the principle of stare decisis. Let's look at the role of guns in contemporary American society. Estimates are that America has more guns in civilian hands, some 320 million, than any other nation state. As of 2022, our rate of homicide per 100,000 was 4.12, almost 8 times the amount of any other industrial democracy. In 2021, some 48,830 people died from gun-related injuries, and gun murders have increased 45% since 2019. Maybe most interesting, given that we are in the business of educating the young, guns are now the leading cause of death amongst kids in the United States. So let's dig down deep to evaluate this historic method of interpretation and the meaning of the Second Amendment by going to our resident historian and 18th century expert, Professor Tim Moore. So, Tim, let us start as broadly as we can, and that is, let's talk about the role of history. What is the challenge and potential problems of using history as a primary approach to understanding and applying the Constitution and Bill of Rights to 21st century American society?
Wow. Well, I think there's a lot of challenges and a lot of problems, but I'll spare us all a dissertation. But I think broadly speaking, and by the way, this is a great, I think it's a great way to start out a question about the Second Amendment, frankly. Well, actually any amendment. So I'm glad that you didn't get right to the case law, because I'd be sitting here for an hour doing nothing. But I think the challenge, I would characterize the challenge is there's a main challenge. Like when you're using history to make an argument, the challenge is what piece of history, what data points are you pulling from history? For example, in our work every day, we believe that Federalists and Anti-Federalists are both founders. So when people talk about the intent of the founders, okay, well, all right, let's try that on for size. You've got these data points called Federalist viewpoint and Anti-Federalist viewpoint. So these are conflicting data points within a framework of founders. So I think the challenge is, what data points are you using from history? The problems I would characterize pretty much in a presentism framework. Does history matter? And that's a problem, I think, for many people. Does an old 18th century document, does history then matter now? Has society evolved and changed and progressed, or whatever term you want to use there, so much that history's relevance really is in question? And that's a big problem, and especially in a culture like ours, where I think a lot of people aren't particularly historical in the way they think. And I think, well, for guys like me, that's a real problem. But I think in general, the use of history in modern times is a tough sell, and that's a problem. And ultimately, I think there's conservatives are often known for believing that the past matters. And there's varying degrees of that too. I think, you're really uber conservatives would say the past matters so much that you never mess with anything, and any Chesterton fence you see in the woods, you don't dare mess with it. And then there are other conservatives says, yes, the past matters, and maybe we can consult that, and it should be a consideration. I think for those on the left side of the aisle, they aren't as committed to a rigid commitment to the past. And so they're more open and flexible in terms of how, on this question of, does the past matter? So I think your view of history, your view of how history and human history factors into this question of the problems associated with using the past. Conservatives, it's a problem because they're committed to it, I think, a little bit more than liberals.
So, well, I'm curious.
And one more thing. I thought about this a little bit yesterday when your questions came through, David, and I came up with a handy dandy visual. Let's try this on for size. We can screen share here. In any interpretation, you've got down there in the very center. Imagine these circles as a piece of text, and in any text there's a word. Well, you've got to interpret a word, and then sometimes that doesn't help. So you interpret the word within the phrase. And then sometimes the phrase is within a larger clause. And that clause may help interpret the phrase and may in turn might interpret the word. Well, then in the Constitution, you have sections. There are principles in each of those sections that may help us interpret a clause, a phrase, or a word. And, likewise, there are various articles in the Constitution. Then you go to this thing called, well, if you need more help interpreting articles, sections, clauses, phrases, or words, there are constitutional principles. Well, okay. There's several of those too, by the way. And then you got this other thing called, I just kind of put history and culture. That interpreting history and culture may help us interpret principles, which in turn may help us interpret article, section, clauses, phrase, and words. Now, each one of those is rife with its own problems. Again, going to the question of which data points are you going to pull in your analysis at any one of those levels. So, I mean, I kind of slap this together for the purposes of students thinking about, to your original question, is what are the problems of interpreting and applying old history in all of this? Well, there's words, phrases, clauses, sections, articles, principles, and culture that all come to play in that. And that's kind of to flesh out the challenge and the problems to your question.
Well, this may reflect my simplistic mind, but it seems to me that what the current court is doing is putting history and culture in the center of this model, and maybe putting the word on the outer edges.
Well, I don't know that should surprise us, given the fact that they're self-proclaimed conservatives, and like I said, conservatives are a little more interested, or sometimes deeply interested, in the bindingness of the past. So to me, that's not surprising.
I guess I would push back a little bit just on what you said, David. I think if you think of what Justice Scalia had moved towards, it was less original intent, more like original meanings. I mean, he would claim that he was he was looking at words and phrases and clauses and trying to decipher what those would mean to the public at large at a certain point in history. So to me, maybe it's more of a three-dimensional shape. I think that, but I think there's different ways to do it. But I do think that most folks who would consider themselves to be originalists, they're using the history to explain, I think, the words and phrases. So I don't think it's disconnected from the words and phrases, but I think the history is the forefront in saying what that word and phrase means.
Okay, so we're trying to figure out the meaning of whatever amendment, all right, because it's not just the second in which this method of interpretation has developed. The First Amendment, the Due Process Amendments, the 14th Amendment, we're seeing this method really blossom and flower here. I'm just wondering how much. So we're looking at a 21st century society. I'm wondering, it's one thing if it's American history and an American constitutional history, how much weight, because in this decision, they spend multiple pages on English common law and English history, going all the way back to the 14th century. I'm just wondering how much weight, in the opinion of this panel, should English history and English common law carry when we're trying to ascertain the meaning of words in the 21st century, regardless of what issue it is. So just in a broader sense. Tim?
Well, I don't know. However, I think it's interesting. I guess another question, and I don't have a strong opinion about this either. Where do you start on that scale? Do you start with the word, or do you start with way out on the edges there of historical analysis and work your way into the word? Or do you look at the word and work yourself out? So I guess for me, when I look at a conservative set of justices, it doesn't surprise me that they're spending a lot of time digging way back into the history and culture. Because again, I think conservatives they want to make the deeply rooted in our traditions argument. So if you can go back to the 1400s in England, and people can survive reading it, in an opinion, it doesn't surprise me. And I think if they're conservatives, they're kind of obligated to do that.
Well, Professor Kavanaugh, this seems to feed into, I guess before I question, you want to jump in there.
Well, I'm wondering how Mr. Jefferson, a strict constructionist, who also believed that that usufruct that belongs to the living. So I wonder how he would, square that circle, or circle that square, or whatever cliche you want to use, because if you're a strict constructionist of your interpretation of the Constitution, and yet you believe that it should be for the people that are alive at the time, I wonder what he would have to say. I have no idea. I'm just curious. So,
well, again, that leads, because this seems to, kind of hit us at the core of what has been an ongoing debate, or at least it was, I think, in when while Justice Scalia was alive, and that's this debate over kind of, I think, how Tim phrased it, how you see the Constitution. Is it a living Constitution, or is it a dead Constitution? Like in the words of Scalia, Scalia would describe it as a dead Constitution. What are your thoughts about that debate? And what I look at, like privacy, all right? Because one of the things that Scalia and some other conservative justices would say is, listen, looking at the history and tradition of this country, if we look at 18th century, the concept of privacy within reproductive, arenas was not on the mind, or was not part of society. Therefore, that's not how we're going to interpret it. That in that sense, the Constitution is dead. How do you feel about that debate?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the problems with originalism, if that's, I think, what you're asking me, is that you have amateur historians, and as we like to say on this program, and as Tim just alluded to, when you say, well, the founders thought, the framers thought, well, no, you can't do that, because they thought a lot of different things. And so when you have these amateur historians, we'll call them justices, going back and trying to find bits and pieces of history, just involved in a discussion this afternoon about the Dobbs decision and Alito's, opinion in Dobbs, going back, centuries and centuries. But again, he's cherry picking parts of history. There's another problem with it, is the translation aspect. David, you mentioned the word privacy, and I think it's Professor Amar, Yale Professor Amar, that talked about these guys wouldn't have used the word privacy in the 18th century, in the late 1700s. They would have used the word security, right? They wouldn't have used privacy, because privy was the outhouse, and they're not going to be talking about your bathroom routine, but to be secure in one's person's, houses, papers, and effects. We see that in the Fourth Amendment. So therein also lies the issue with it. And then again, back to the Jefferson part about the belongs and usufruct to the living, or how bound are we going to be to generations of people where women didn't have the right to vote? I mean, I think the current case coming up that being heard this term, Rahimi, which is a gun control case, deals with the guys. He's arguing that his Second Amendment right is being violated because he has a restraining order against him. Well, you can go back to take a look during the founding era. Women didn't have the rights that they have today. There is coverture. So should we be bound by that in terms of saying a person that has a restraining order against them should not be able to own a firearm? That creates a lot of problems. But I don't think, I'm not discounting history. I'm with Tim. I think history is important. We have to understand the history, but I think there are other factors that go into play here. I think I'm real fond of Jack Balkin, Yale. I think he's Yale, a law professor. He has a book called Living Originalism, and he takes the originalists to task pretty early in the text, but he does come up with this concept of the rules, but also the principles, as Tim mentioned. So there are constitutional rules, but there are also constitutional principles behind those rules. So I think that I like that, his concept and his arguments. And I'll put the book in the resources, and I'll actually give you a couple of reviews as well to post on the book. So I think I just, the whole concept of trying to go back in history, that you can't encapsulate, it's too broad.
Well, it seems to me that your concern of history is kind of the flip side of Scalia's concern of living constitutionalism, in that there's what restraints are there on the justices to decide what that is. That is, if we're going to take this modernism, well, let's look at these principles and apply it to the 21st century. What are the guardrails that exist on justices to decide, what those principles are and what shape and form they take in the 21st century? It seems to me that what you're pointing out and what Tim points out is that being so tied to history also, especially because I think we'd all agree that we can agree sometimes in the field of history on the where and the when. All right. But the why, and in fact, that's the fun of history, is trying to come up with maybe a consensus view of the why, and that is ever changing sometimes as we get more access to historical resources and historical information. Yeah, Tim.
Well, Chris's point about the meaning of words, I was looking into this a little bit yesterday, and the word arms is an interesting word exercise, because the meaning of arms back in the 1600s could have meant pikes and swords and bows and arrows. And so just the single, back to that set of circles that we had. So you have to do some historical analysis, even at the word level.
Well, yeah, absolutely. The Statute of Northampton, in which the justices on both sides deal with, which is 1328. There's a list of arms. All right, it's not just a single shot. I don't know how you would describe the gun of the 14th century, but it also created was talking about swords, knives, clubs, a whole array of things that were arms at the time. Mike?
Yeah, no, I think your original kind of question, and I just wanted to highlight to the students, it is important to consider what rules of interpretation in a democratic society do we want some unelected folks to have, right, in terms of interpreting the Constitution. And like Tim and Chris and Dave have already said, history should be used, but history should not be dispositive. And it seems to me where the straw man argument that's been set up by, I think, Justice Scalia and Justice Thomas now and Alito and others, is to pretend like that we don't already we have a common law tradition. And David, you mentioned stare decisis, which is a rule within common law that precedent matters, and precedent is part of our history as well. And I know we're going to talk about maybe other countries in a little bit, so I won't jump to it now, but I would just say that you could be a jurist and you could say, I'm going to be an original meanings person, but precedent is going to be dominant, right? I'm not going to overrule precedent with my original meaning take, right? Which interestingly is what Scalia kind of claims was his metamorphosis, right? Didn't he call himself a lighthearted originalist at some point? Because he would let precedent stop him from making his arguments, right? But he said, I'm not doing that because of my theory. I'm doing that because I'm trying to be pragmatic. And near the end of his life, I think he was moving away from that. And I think Justices Thomas and Alito have completely away from that. They have no problem turning over decades of hundreds of years of precedent to do their original meaning. So history can be used in a way that's a little more thoughtful, I think, and it doesn't have to be the only tool that you have in your interpretive toolkit.
Well, it seems to me it clearly is the dominant tool of Thomas and Alito here. And I'm wondering, Professor Moore, if you have that much attachment to history, doesn't it shackle you, all right, to a cultural existence that is so out of line with the world that we live in, i.e., white male dominance is going to win every time if we latch on to cultural and historic tradition.
Or maybe even Protestant if you're going back into England too. So, that question, David, is just rife with all kinds of my head's spinning with that question. What was it again? Aren't we stuck with white male dominance if we go back into history?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So the answer is yes, but I think a rebuttal to that would be, well, then do we abandon it all because of that real or perceived problem? My answer is you don't abandon it all. But again, I would say that history does matter and you're obligated to consult it in a system that espouses stare decisis.
So, Professor Williams, let's get into some specific things about the Second Amendment. In 1991, retired Chief Justice Warren Burger said that the Second Amendment has been the subject of one of the greatest pieces of fraud. I repeat the word fraud on the American public by special interest groups that I have ever seen in my lifetime. That's Justice Warren Burger. How do you understand Burger's words, and to what degree has or should constitutional understanding been shaped by politics and culture, i.e., special interest groups and things like that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So for the students, you can all look this up, but Warren Burger was the Chief Justice until 1986, right? When then William Rehnquist takes over. So this is, as David said, it's 1991. It's an interview on, I think, PBS NewsHour. I think what Rehnquist is getting at there is he knows the precedent, not only of the Supreme Court, but of a lot of dozens of federal courts who had looked at the Second Amendment. And I also saw something today, there wasn't one law review article written from the time they were indexing law review articles up until that period. No one had made the argument the Second Amendment was an individual right. So he's basing it based on, he thinks he knows the truth about what the text means. He also knows his precedent. And so he is, I think, paying respect there. What I think he also knows is that the notion of originalism comes out, it's an effort by conservatives to roll back the rights, quote, revolution from the Warren and Burger courts. And I just can't help, as I was reading this, just to think about what we've talked about in numerous programs, how America was in this grade of profound social, political, and economic change in the 1960s, just as we were maybe right after the Civil War. And by golly, if it doesn't take just we get into the 70s and there is a backlash against that very movement. It's a backlash against maybe protecting people in our society who we're not used to protecting or even seeing as worth human dignity. So the idea of originalism was brought up by conservatives as we need to restrain these judges. Ed Meese, who was the Secretary of Justice Department in the 1980s, said this was his policy in the 1980s to support originalism. Burger is on the court when Meese is saying this. The Federalist Society is founded in 1982. He is seeing in 1991's the beginnings of a movement that is not just legal. In fact, at this point, it's more political and social than it is legal, but he sees how it's creeping into the judicial branch, I think. So I think his words there are coming from that vantage point, that he is seeing this happen. Now, whether Burger, the second part of your question, whether Burger might admit, and we all might admit, that politics and history is always influencing jurists. It influenced jurists maybe during the progressive period and definitely during the post-World War II rights era, right? So that's a harder one for me to get at. But with Burger, I just think that he is pretty determined that he knows, and a lot of other jurists and academics know what the Second Amendment means. And it feels like he's just he's pissed, right? I mean, he's in good company. Robert Bork is making the same argument at that time. I mean, Bork is saying that the Second Amendment, and Bork is, he's no liberal, right? The students, look up Robert Bork, not just the noun, but the verb as well, right? And so I hope that answers the question, David. I think that's the context for understanding Burger's.
Well, okay, so I've got to ask this. So we've got the National Rifle Association, the Federalist Society, which now are focused on what I'll say carpet bombing, all right, judicial and political society, with articles and such arguing that the Second Amendment is a individual right, yada yada yada. All right, and by the time we get to Heller, that has become the overwhelming, all right, major or core understanding by a majority of American people. Mm-hmm. And even in academia, it seems to me that this concerted effort by these groups associated with the conservative movement are very effective. However, is that any different than what the NAACP was doing in the 1930s and 40s in trying to get to overturn Plessy and Plessy's understanding of the 14th Amendment? Is there an equivalency there?
I think there could be. I mean, in some ways, this absolutist position of the NRA kind of dabbles on the edge of substantive rights. And they're going to glom on to some a word or phrase within the Second Amendment and say that equals individual right, and to articulate it in individual ownership terms. So I think they come late, in my estimation. They come late to the rights revolution party, and they find a way to do it through, in my estimation, kind of selectively looking at one part of the Second Amendment. So I see it as an extension of the rights revolution in an odd way. That conservatives are using to articulate individual ownership rights.
Mike or Chris?
Go ahead, Chris.
Well, I think that's true. I think if you look at McDonald versus Chicago, which will incorporate the Second Amendment, and Justice Thomas's concurrence, he is going to cite privileges and immunities, and which is I think it's probably a good argument to make. And it's using history, post-Civil War history, about arming African Americans in the South to protect themselves from, night riders and Klan members. So I think it's an interesting and probably, honestly, somewhat of a valid argument. But he also has a little footnote in there too and this is prior to the Obergefell decision, that he understands that opening that door to privileges and immunities claims opens the door for other rights claims as well, which he was not, wanting to do that. But I mean, I think Justice Stevens says the same thing, that, for over 200 years after the writing of the amendment, it was understood by every court in the land that it was going to apply for, and going back to Tim's word, arms, you're being armed for the local militia, right? That is the issue there, and that no federal law can step in and say, okay, local places you can limit as you want. And you can go back into the colonial era and see the limitations on gun ownership. Even I think Washington in 1776 said, well, these people that don't support the revolution, we don't want them to have guns, just like the Protestants in England didn't want the Catholics to have arms. So
yeah, I guess my question, it'd be nice to talk with Warren Berger, to take a time capsule back, and I'd like to ask him, okay, I understand, and I agree with the Chief Justice on this manipulation of both history and language to create something that had never existed in our history, but I would ask him, isn't that exactly what the NAACP does in the middle part of the 20th century? Because we have a controlling ruling. We have Plessy versus Ferguson. That is the law of the land. And the NAACP will go about over a few decades of working, I'm not going to, of coming up with arguments to say, hey, the court really got it wrong here. And they do their lobbying, they do their politics. Aren't they the same thing? And therefore,
no.
For Berger to call those in the gun movement frauds, he would also have to call those. Mike, go ahead. Now I think you know what.
Yeah, no, I do disagree with that equivalency, and I guess here's my argument. I would, and again, I can't get into Berger's mind on this. There's a type of interpretation jurists can do that is called purposive, right? It's like, okay, let's put our common sense glasses on and think about what the purpose of this clause or section was, right? And not get into the debates, because there's going to be pros and cons and different, but can we glean a purpose? And I think what Berger would argue with the Second Amendment, the idea of a well-regulated militia, which is in the text, taken as the purpose, he would say, that doesn't quite fit with, seeing that as an individual right doesn't quite fit. Okay. Now, I would argue that when the NAACP is arguing against Plessy, they have a lot to go on to argue that the 14th Amendment was clearly an amendment that was not passed to keep us divided. And you could go and cherry pick your history, and we could listen to the Southern Democrats during those debates. And if you wanted to use all of their statements and argue what the 14th Amendment was about, you could come up with a different reading of the 14th, but that would get away from the purpose, right? I think it's clear that most of the Supreme Court decisions in the 19th century on the 14th Amendment did not live up to the purpose of that amendment. We could look at Slaughterhouse. We can look at Minor v. Happersett. I mean, they just go down the line, and Plessy is part of that. So I think the NAACP is on stronger ground than Berger is, or than what you're trying to make with the equivalency.
I'm gonna talk out of both sides of my mouth, as I tend to do anyway. But I'm going to put that out there. First of all, I'm going to push back just a little bit, Mike, because I've been doing some reading, and the same Congress that will pass through the Civil Rights Act of 1866, as well as the 14th Amendment, had no problem with segregated schools in Washington, D.C. at that time. So they had that. But I'm going to say, David, I disagree with your premise in the fact that, I mean, the Supreme Court's mission statement is on the front of the building. That's their mission statement: equal justice under law. And if the law is passed where all of us, no matter who we are, no matter where we live, or I shouldn't say that, can't own a chain gun, well, so be it. It applies to everyone equally. But when you start to segregate based upon suspect class, fellow Caroline products, when you start to segregate based on a suspect class, and we know that that segregation also leads to unequal treatment under the law based upon an ethnicity or an immutable circumstance, therein you do not have equal treatment under the law. So I think there's a difference there.
So,
Tim, you look like you're perplexed there.
Not yet. Soon to be there. Soon to be there.
Yeah, I am, but I don't want to get us off track and then go down that rabbit hole of equal protection and historic meetings there. But again, I think we've given the students something to think about when it comes to what Berger was saying. So, Professor Moore, you're the 18th century historian here, and you live your life in 18th century ratification documents and newspapers and the like. So, although Thomas and Alito advocate for historical tradition determining meaning, we cannot ignore the words. All right. And your little diagram that you had words right there in the center. So to the best of your ability, what do you, and again, well, I'll just leave it to, what do you think the founding framing generation meant by well-regulated militia?
Well,
and the right of the people to bear arms.
Well, there you go. I think one of the crux of the matter of the Second Amendment is the word militia in the first part, the same as people in the second part. And I think, well, let me back up here. We know that Madison, when he composed the Bill of Rights and was pushing them through Congress, we know that he was fearful of states. That drove his whole agenda going into the convention. And so, and we also know that he didn't want, in all these proposed amendments that came, that he was using to create the Bill of Rights, I think I counted as 5.5 states sent along recommend, and I'll don't. Let's just say 5. Let's just say 5. Because North Carolina is the curveball on this. Anyway, so there are 5 states that send along recommendatory amendments that mention arms or militia or guns, arms. So 5. So he's, and I would urge students to look at New York and Virginia, actually. They've got some, it's really an interesting set of statements coming from New York and Virginia about this issue. But well-regulated militia, there are 3 words there. Well, regulated and militia. Well, okay, if you do a word analysis and a historical analysis, you're not going to get a crystal clear picture of what that means, because that meant different things in different states. prior to the Second Amendment. I mean, in revolutionary and early state periods, militias, I mean, there's a lot of people that looked askance at militias even after the American Revolution and said they were only an excuse to get together and drink and have a party. And many of them showed up without weaponry, these state militias. So the people and militia is a textual problem. Well regulated. I mean, how many regulations equals well regulated? So when Madison writes this thing, I think he's trying to thread the needle again. What would get ratified by the states? I mean, these amendments have to be ratified by the states, and I think in all of the early state constitutions, 11, I think, out of 13 have these statements about their regulating their militias within their state. So I'm going to suggest that Madison's choice of words is also an effort to make sure this can get through the states. And using the phrase well-regulated militia is, I think, a phrase that resonates and would say to the states, the national government's not going to take over your militias. Now, the other problem on this is people the same as militia in the Second Amendment. Is there an individual right that's mentioned in the second phrase, but a collective right in the first phrase? I think both sides were right, because there was individual ownership. And there was this commitment in the states to have collective ownership in the form of militias. So I think both sides in part have an argument that there is an individual nature to this as well as a collective. But even in the states that have individual ownership, there's always these statements about, yeah, but there's this commitment to collective militia. And then we get into the right of the states to actually regulate those militias. So there's always that caveat, even in colonial and early state constitutions, that the state governments could regulate. And they did. Even individual ownership in some cases.
Well, and my understanding is, okay, so it possibly can be an individual right, but that individual right does not presuppose a sense of absolute nature. It has to be seen within the context of a social contract. Is that not right?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the states says you can own these individually, but if it causes public harm or public injury. So there's all kinds of qualifiers that appear through the state constitutions that kind of limit the absolutist position of ownership.
So, Chris, I'm wondering if we go from, taking what Tim has said, and I think this panel would agree, all right, that to me it doesn't matter necessarily if the Second Amendment establishes an individual right or not. And I'm willing, okay, fine, it does establish, as Tim has, I think, mapped out for us, some element of an individual right there. It still has to be seen through the context of the social contract, and what we constantly harp on with students and teachers, that rights in our system are not absolute there. And then, what bothers me is, going back to the initial question of this whole discussion, is the cherry picking, element of the court and the history of gun regulation. I mean, just in my little research over the last week or so, I found 5 states by 1792 that had kind of open carry laws. You've just mentioned another that states were regulating arms in the colonial period and in the state, early state period there. And so that's partly what bothers me. But what I'm wondering, Professor Kavanaugh, is as we've gone from Heller to Bruen, all right, I have read that some people say that they have eliminated any and all restrictions on gun ownership in the United States. Do you agree with that conclusion with some scholars and political commentators? That
I think we're moving. We appear to be moving in that direction. And the case I mentioned, Rahimi, that's coming up, we're going to see whether or not a person that has a restraining order can be taken away. I mean, and you can look up some pretty tragic stories about what's happened with people with restraining orders against them and gun violence. And as you mentioned at the top of the show, David, the gun violence that we have now versus the gun violence that it's interesting because I was reading about the Rahimi case, and if there was going to be violence towards a spouse, a man versus a woman, almost always, not always, but almost always, a gun was not going to be used because they were too cumbersome. It wasn't a weapon to be used because it was too inconvenient. You're going to pick up something that's laying around to beat your spouse with. Now, obviously, the technology of guns have changed, but I think there's a rich history in colonial as well as early states, in states being able to limit gun ownership to people that maybe present a danger to the peace. And if you felt, I wonder about this because I'm doing some reading. I'm wondering how the idea is that you're carrying your musket to the local store. People will say, "Well, why are you doing that? Why do you need to do that?" The colonies and states had regulations that would preserve the peace. And if you felt threatened by someone carrying that arm or that weapon into a place, there's a possibility that person could be rescinded versus someone that has to have their AR-15 strapped across their back to go get a cup of coffee these days. I think there is a fear that there's any restriction is going to be gone. And as we all know, and I think we've taught our students for years, that no right is absolute. I think from a person that's in the classroom, we want to limit what a kid can read because it could be dangerous, but we don't want to do any kind of common sense gun reform to protect kids from school shootings. We want to turn schools into armed fortresses. We don't want to maybe think about something that could be, limit the size of a clip, red flag laws, other laws that may, I'm going to underline may, prevent certain things. But we know that if a person has, made up the decision to carry out a heinous act, there's not a lot that's going to stop them. But, it's frustrating because does seem like we're moving in that way that no regulation will be allowed. And I think that flies in the face of history, the very history that they use to try and justify some of their opinions.
Professor Williams.
Yeah, I want to add on that. I think Chris is absolutely right. The Rahimi case is going to be the test. And I think I have this right, guys. So correct me if I don't. But to me, the other thing that Bruen does that is just like we have to just see if the court's going to adopt this new test. Usually the court says, okay, if there's a fundamental right involved, then the burden is can the state show a compelling reason to regulate it? Dave, to your point, right? No right is absolute. States regulate fundamental rights all the time if they have a compelling state interest. In this case, I think Justice Thomas actually says this two-step analysis, I believe, is one step too much. And he basically, I think his analysis is that we've found that there's a fundamental right to individual right to have arms, to have guns. So now the burden is, can the state show us a regulation at the time of the passage of the Second Amendment that is equivalent to the regulation now, right? It's that sort of, and while a lot of justices, those who are conservatives and those more liberal, like Stevens, they've used history, like they've been in this history debate. This seems to me as a different type of analysis. And I don't know if this is one of these Bush v. Gore types of things where the court said something in Bush v. Gore about the 14th Amendment and then never used that analysis again type of thing, or whether.
And they specifically said that it can't be used.
Exactly. Or whether this is going to be the analysis that they're really going to hang on to with Rahimi, because I think Chris is right. If that is the case, it just not only for Second Amendment, but First Amendment, Establishment Clause. Oh my goodness. It could literally be a Back to the Future kind of moment.
Well, I would argue that the Establishment Clause has all but dead as well. That this court only sees one of those clauses, and that's the free exercise clause, and that especially with the both in the general public arena, i.e., the accommodation laws, and the more recent one on what was that web designer decision on religious liberty there. That when it comes to public accommodations and things like that, the Establishment Clause has been erased. And if we look at schools, all right, and the last decision on coaches and prayers, right at the end of the game there. So, but I do think you're right, Mike, that if the court does use Bruen as the precedent, Rahimi they're going to rule that yes, this individual's Second Amendment right has been violated. There's just no other conclusion you can come to if they use that precedent, which is going to be real interesting to watch and hear. So you're the comparativist there, Professor Williams. So I'm wondering, to what extent do other constitutional republics / democracies emphasize historical tradition as a guide to constitutional understanding? Are we once again exceptional and the outlier?
I just want to highlight for the students, David, you came up with some great questions for this. This is a great question. I had never thought about this before, and I had so much fun researching it. So I found a couple of really great law review articles that we'll share in the show notes, and I'm not going to try to go through every single argument, but I could, because I'm so excited about this question. So
good night, everybody.
Yeah, really. Yes, we are an outlier. We are exceptional. And there's two different ways to look at it in terms of, do other courts use history? Yes, other courts will use history. Specifically, though, there's been a lot of good research on, do other courts use originalism, as we've been talking about? And this one law review article from 2009 basically says, no, we're the only one. Australia a little bit, but it's distinguishable. And then I came across another law review article that says, no, there's actually three other countries that do exactly kind of what we do. And they're not going to be the countries that I think any student would come up with on their own. Turkey, Singapore, and Malaysia. And they all use originalism differently than the United States. Turkey and Malaysia use it similar to us. Singapore is a little different. So we are outliers. And what's super interesting about this, it's not because other jurists around the globe haven't heard about originalism. I mean, our justices, Justice Scalia and others, in their time off, go all around the world giving lectures, talking about originalism.
Or perhaps going on vacations paid for by other people, but
yeah,
that's another story for another day.
Slow down here, Chris. Yeah. Slow down.
Well, if they are doing that, then I can understand why taxpayers are paying for it. So that's or donors, whatever. Other folks know about it. They don't use it. And so then the next question is kind of like, okay, why? Like, why is the United States? And I was happy that a lot of the reasons that scholars are giving are a lot of the things we've been talking about on this show for a couple of years now. I'll just highlight a couple of them. The argument is that this type of analysis is obviously part of culture, right? And it goes into, one, we, unlike a lot of other countries, treat our Constitution as not only as like a power document, as a legal text, like it's an ethical text. It's a national identity text. And that, so these debates have a certain meaning. The fact that we see our birth in the revolution, and that it was a revolution and not an evolution, and makes me think of our friend Kermit Roosevelt III. If we only saw our birth at the Civil War, we'd be having different discussions. So there's those kinds of historical things going on. There's national identity, and then there is this idea of like it's part of this backlash against the rights revolution. And who knows if a country like Canada has more time. They've only had a constitution that's been written since 1982, right? Anyways, basic rights. Maybe you'll see similar, like, courts using this as a way to sort of push back against where they see some jurists are taking, like moving the country too far forward or too progressive. But no, we just don't see other countries doing it. It's a really interesting question, and I found some really great resources for the students on this. So thank you for sending me down that rabbit hole, David.
I think that Mike's point about culture is interesting because I have a lot of friends that are conservative evangelicals, and I think the this notion that like in the Old Testament, there's this cataclysmic moment where Israel gets the law, and I know there's a rabbinic tradition that it revolves around the interpretation of that law. But I think for a lot of conservative Christians, many are also conservative politically, they're afraid to mess with a, quote, sacred document because that would be like messing with scripture. So I think this originalism for them is rooted in you don't mess with a sacred text. And that's why originalism and original meaning or original intent is such a big deal, I think, for a lot of conservative evangelicals, and which I think make up the bulk of a large percentage of those that are very committed to this original thing about individual gun ownership.
There's I don't know if you guys have followed, there's a relatively new book out, and I want to think that one of the authors' name is Levitsky or whatever, called Tyranny of the Minority. I don't know if you've become aware of this, but Mike just used a phrase. You called the Constitution as an epical text there, and they talk about this notion of constitutional stasis, that we as a nation are kind of trapped in this constitutional structure and constitutional world defined in the 18th and 19th century, because we see our founding documents and the Constitution and Bill of Rights as almost religious documents rather than governing principles and such. Would you guys agree with that? That we're kind of, that's one of the reasons we're stuck, is because
that's one of the reasons I have a job, because people always ask, what originally did they mean? So I'm frankly happy about that. No, that's a smarmy answer. I think we are stuck, and I think it's a cultural issue more so than a legal. I mean, to Mike's point.
I think it's also a power issue. I think it's a power issue for certain groups of people that find that as a way to exercise power by manipulating the court. I think if you look at a lot of the writing that ProPublica has done lately, talking about the Federalist Society and Leo, his last name escapes me now, but you see how much money has been sunk into controlling the Supreme Court. It becomes a power issue too. So how can we justify the decisions to maintain the power that we're seeking? And we rely on the history because that gives us the best. Well, I want to say I don't agree that it's the best, but their argument would be that we can appeal to people that way because we can say, well, look what our history shows us. Our history shows us that, yeah, I mean, these rights exist or these rights don't exist. I mean, look at the Dobbs decision.
Well, yeah, and it just to kind of the last question to all of you here is, I was educated to understand that one of the key principles, values of our constitutional arrangement is balance. Is kind of and I think Sandra Day O'Connor emphasized this notion of balancing tests. If you rely on this Bruen standard here of history tradition, can you balance between individual rights and the common good in the 21st century if we're going to use historical tradition as a guiding principle?
I think it's hard. I mean, to one of my original points, it depends on which pieces of history, which data points you're going to be using in your argumentation. And it's so complex in the colonial and early state period that if you're going to go back there, you're going to go down a rabbit hole, because you can find data points for all kinds of arguments.
I think hard is an understatement. I think it's virtually impossible, simply because you're going to find a plethora of different laws and regulations and statutes. That even the concept of general law or common law that existed. It's because a justice finds one statute or one piece of colonial legislation or something, you're going to find others that they'll counter that. So which one carries more weight? I'm kind of re-saying what Tim just said. I think is more than difficult.
Yeah, I mean, you could get balancing. You could get balancing, but you're going to be balancing different interpretations of history.
Yeah.
And that's where you're turning the jurists into historians, which that may be worse than turning political scientists into historians.
Or historians into political science. Yeah. Woo.
Something like that. I mean, I was reading something about just really quickly about, the South African Constitution is, brand new compared to ours. It was passed in 1996. And there's this question that the Constitutional Court early on developed this thing that some are calling the grand narrative of apartheid history. And they use that as a way to sort of give life to the meaning of what the Constitution's all about, right? That the Constitution was a reaction to apartheid. So they structure their decisions that way, right? Well, the scholar kind of takes him to task and he says, look, this is dangerous because there's different historical interpretations of apartheid. And the one the court has adopted is one that apartheid was all about racial discrimination and racism. There's a strong school of thought that says apartheid was all about class and classism, that was the root of apartheid and it wasn't race. And by the court adopting one grand narrative, it's really freezing out these other discussions that other courts could use. So even in a place like South Africa that has a more recent constitution, where many of those jurists were alive and part of those discussions of the Constitution being adopted, all of them knowing the history because they lived through apartheid, even then it's hard to do because history is just constantly, I don't want to say it's changing, but we're always revising our understandings of history because of like you said, and Tim, but what we learn and what frameworks we have and what concepts we have to understand the past. So it's yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, Mike. Listen to you. I'm just going to throw one other thing in there, and I've used this before, but the Helvidius Pacificus debates between Hamilton and Madison, in constitutional interpretation. So, I mean, here we are, just immediately after the Constitution is ratified. Washington's in his presidency, and he wants to pull us out of a treaty. And wait a minute, can you unilaterally pull us out of a treaty, or does the Senate need to be involved? And immediately, you've got the two guys that wrote the dang thing, helped write the dang thing, and get it ratified, are arguing about its interpretation. So how in the hell are we supposed to use history to give us clarity if these guys were on the ground when it happened? I mean, they were, back to quote Hamilton, they were in the room. And they're arguing. I mean, how are we using history for clarity in the 21st century?
Sorry, I know Tim. Alexander Hamilton, and you're no Alexander Hamilton.
Thank God, thank goodness. I've never been in a gunfight in my life.
Well, that's a good place to bring this to closure. And I kind of want to build off of that for students and teachers. And just, to emphasize once again, that you are not obligated to affirm the court, the government, the question, or whatever. And that I think this question very much asks you to take Thomas and Alito and the majority in Bruen to task, and that we have to be very careful when we are going to use history. And I want to refer to a line in the decision. All right, that I think says it all about the problem with using history, because the history of Sir John Knight, the Sir John Knight case, and is not, I mean, it's hilarious. British historians don't pay attention to it. British historians say it has really absolutely no meaning whatsoever. It's American historians that are all fixated with Sir John Knight, and the majority in the Bruen case uses Sir John Knight case as one of its antecedents and precedents for coming up with its interpretation. And this is what the majority says. They say, to the extent that there are multiple plausible interpretations of the Sir John Knight case, we will favor the one that is more consistent with the Second Amendment command. So we're going to take the interpretation that affirms what we think. All right, which is always the danger of cherry picking history. So keep that in mind, students and teachers. Gentlemen, your final thoughts, recommendations, insight for students and teachers, Professor Williams?
Well, I'm amazed that to discover justices are more British than we think they are. If they're doing that, that's concerning, right?
Go ahead, Tim. What are your final?
This is a wonderful question, and well, I've had a blast because I think David, the way you started it out had nothing to do with guns, and I think my recommendation is to students to really think about what, because your first question was what's the meaning of history? What's the purpose of history? And I think that was a wonderful place to start the discussion. And I would like to pass that along to students. Don't get bogged down in cases. I mean, know your cases, but there's a history to this, and go through the exercise and frankly, the frustration of which data points are you looking at, and is it relevant? I think that is I hope you embrace those two principles as you investigate this question.
Professor Williams.
Oh man, I don't. I guess I'll just add this for the students to think about. If this is going to be the dominant interpretive theory that cases are going to be decided upon, for those on the court or those of us who have different views than Alito or Thomas, do we stop fighting the game and just start playing it with them? In other words, should we all become historians and just start coming up with different interpretations of history that will support frankly, the political and the social and cultural sort of outcomes that we want? There are some scholars that suggest that's what it's come down to. So I don't really have a tip. I mean, that might be a fun exercise for y'all to think about, to read through the dissents on some of these and see what it'd be like to I don't know, come up with different histories to support your point.
Professor Kavanaugh.
If I had a class and we were doing this, Michael, we would do exactly that. I think my students will be going through and finding other historical data points, as Tim referred to, and we would come right back with, well, what about this New Hampshire? What about the Pennsylvania ratifying convention? What about here? What about here? What about this? What about this? What about this? And I think that we would pepper them with those ideas that, holy, what history are we talking about here? Not only should you read the dissents, students, but also go to SCOTUS blog and take a look at some of the amicus briefs.
Yeah,
I think if you look at these amicus briefs, they are We the People arguments on steroids, and you will see some really good arguments laid out on how to perhaps push back on this. I agree with David on that you don't have to accept the majority opinion, or if you accept the majority opinion, again, go to those amicus briefs, because the justices will read those and they're influential. So take a look at some of those and you'll find some information there, but dive into the history and see what you come up with.
So I want to close with a little recommendation. There's a podcast that I listen to called Revisionist History with Malcolm Gladwell, and I think it's season 9. He dedicated 6 episodes to guns, doctors. I forget what else it is, but it's fascinating. And the first 2 episodes really do deal with our understanding of the Second Amendment and some cultural issues. And there's some fascinating information there. And I think one of the most interesting piece of information is that the reason that if we didn't have the evolution of healthcare to such the advanced stage it is, death by guns would be 80,000, 90,000 a year. because of the work that they do in emergency rooms and such. But I thought one of the most entertaining things that they talked about in episode 2 was the cultural role that Hollywood plays in our love of guns and in American society, particularly focusing on one of my favorite childhood shows, Gunsmoke. And one of the pieces of data they came up with is that through, I forget, it's something like 14 seasons, but the town of Dodge City, or the city of Dodge, said it had something like 2,100 people. And throughout the show, something like 60% of the people are shot during the show because of the gun violence that's worshipped in our westerns during the 50s and 60s. Anyway, that brings to close our discussion on Unit 5, Question 1. Yes, Professor Kavanaugh.
I'm sorry. Well, one more recommendation: a book by Ryan Buss, B-U-S-S-E, is called Gunfight. He is currently running for the governorship of Montana, and he was a big-time player within the gun industry. So he was in the middle of the gun industry, and Gunfight is a fascinating look at how the NRA took over this whole issue. It's a fascinating book.
All right, we'll have a number of things in the resource section of our program. So until next time, in which we are going to talk about the word, one of Kavanaugh's favorite institutions, the United States government, the United States Senate, in our next session. So until then, peace, love, yogurt tacos, bye-bye, bye-bye.